Hello, I'm Daniel Bryant, co-host of the InfoQ podcast, news manager at InfoQ, and product architect at DataWire. And I recently had the pleasure of sitting down with Ryan Kitchens, a senior site reliability engineer and member of the core team at Netflix. Our discussion today begins with a brief look at the role of site reliability engineer at Netflix and explores the value of establishing service level indicators, SLIs, and the associated service level objectives, SLOs. We explore how certain top-level metrics can be substituted as a proxy for user experience, and in turn can be used as a basis to trigger alerts that an incident may need to be investigated. For example, at Netflix, if the customer playback initiation, or streams per second metric declines rapidly, this may be an indication that something is broken on the site. We also cover the post-incident review process, which typically includes a post-mortem and some form of memorialisation, and Ryan suggests that within a complex sociotechnical system, there typically is no root cause. When reviewing an incident, engineers must look for what went right as much as they must search for what went wrong. Focusing on how things go right can provide valuable insight into the resilience within your system, such as what people are doing every day that helps them to avoid and overcome incidents. Finding sources of resilience is somewhat the story of the incident that you didn't have. Ryan continues by stating that failure happens all the time within complex systems, and therefore we must develop skills for dealing with this, and crucially learning from this throughout an organisation. Much can be learned from the fields of cognitive systems engineering and resilience engineering, and Ryan provides several great references for this. Another key lesson discussed is that we should make sure that support staff within an organisation have a feedback loop into the product team, as the people providing frontline support often know where all of the hidden problems are, the nuances of the system, and of course the workarounds. We wrap up the podcast with Ryan sharing his advice on running practice incident game days, and we briefly explore the associated topic of chaos engineering. Then we conclude with a great story about a past incident in which Ryan was involved, and let's be honest, we do all love a good failure story. Having initially met Ryan after his fantastic presentation at QCon New York earlier this year, I very much enjoyed chatting with him in more depth on some of the topics he introduced in that talk. Although obviously we're not all Netflix, people like Ryan and several other folks he mentions on the podcast are very much at the vanguard of working with complex systems. And these are pretty much fast becoming the new normal for most of us, so there is definitely much to be learned here. Hello Ryan, welcome to the InfoQ podcast.
Hi, thanks for having me.
So just to set some context for our listeners, could you explain your current role at Netflix?
Yeah, so I am on a team that we call the core team. And I think it's a little bit novel because the scope of it is pretty big. Anything sort of related to incidents, we kind of have our claws in, so to speak. So that in maybe the worst case, we are the first ones to get a page if people cannot stream on Netflix. And it's just sort of like, go figure it out.
Nice.
And there's a pretty giant breadth of possibilities there in terms of incident response. But we also really maintain the whole lifecycle following the incident, what we call memorializing it, which is a lot of post-incident documents and getting all the charts and events and following up with teams, kind of putting our project management hat on, and then really learning how the incident came to be in the first place. What were sort of the conditions that allowed it to occur? And figuring out what people do during their normal everyday work that often contributes both to overcoming incidents or also encountering them.
Very nice. So you mentioned in the QCon talk, the role is kind of similar to SRE, or Site Reliability Engineering, I should say. And that came out of Google initially, I believe. I mean, I read the SRE books, thoroughly enjoyed them, learned a bunch. Is there quite a lot of overlap between what you do in the SRE pitch?
Yeah, there is. It's definitely not one-to-one with Google's model. I think SRE sort of has its own incarnation at every company, but there's quite a lot of overlap. We don't really do SLOs, like not every team has SLOs. We don't really do error budgets in Netflix. Some teams do, but it's not kind of mandated the way that it is more so at Google. So there is a lot of overlap with SRE. We kind of take on the job title of SRE because that's sort of the closest thing that we have a name for. But I think there are some things we're doing at Netflix that are really pushing the envelope on even what SRE is.
Interesting. So you mentioned there SLOs and of course there's SLIs and error budgets. They're kind of think the most interesting things that I learned out of the SRE movement. Could you break them down a little bit for us? Perhaps our listeners aren't so familiar with these terms.
Yeah, so these are prefixed with service level objectives and indicators. The ultimate goal here is, I think, in effort to reduce things like alert fatigue. What you really want to do are find key performance indicators of a service If you're taking the SRE approach, the service level indicators, you can look at things like latency or response time, error rates, that sort of thing. And your service level objectives are sort of the goals you would like to hit, the expectations you would like to set with other teams to say our service will respond 99.9% of the time faster than 250 milliseconds for these particular calls, right? So when you bring this into the realm of alerting, when you're looking at really top level metrics, these are sort of proxy indicators to say like something has really gone off the rails and we need to go look at it. So at Netflix, I think our greatest example of this are people pressing the play button to start watching a video. So we have various different alerts on this and kind of secondary metrics, but if that metric deviates, we know something is going on and we need to look deeper.
So you mentioned about top level metrics, and even myself as not a Netflix employee, I'm pretty sure I've heard of streams per second. That's one of your go-to metrics, isn't it?
Yes, so there's a lot of historical context on that one. It's evolved over the years, but we still continue to look at this as the best kind of proxy for a user experience for people trying to start a video.
Yeah, your core business is focused on delivering video content to folks, and if they aren't starting streams, I'm guessing you may have some unhappy customers.
Right. What becomes a little more nuanced is how do we find those metrics like that for other teams who are maybe not in the streaming path or sort of on a more individual basis that are not at a giant product level. So if we look at teams, for example, our database teams, that's a much more involved system there. You have a lot of different metrics they could potentially look at. So how does everyone kind of try to find that stream starts per second equivalent? That's sort of the way we kind of go about finding that SLO, is to really use SPS as this shining example of a really good business metric.
Yeah, do you find business metrics for everyone, or do you sometimes have to use proxies?
Sometimes we just have to use proxies. Yeah, it really is a case-by-case basis depending on what the use cases are.
One of the really interesting things I found from your KubeCon New York talk was you mentioned about a focus on how things went right as opposed to how things went wrong. Do you think we as an industry focus a bit too much on what goes wrong?
Yeah, I do. So it's kind of interesting. I say we do, but that is really through the lens of the reliability space. So I think absolutely we focus too much on failure. You may find startup stories and stuff who focus too much on success and overselling it. In our space, definitely, I think there is this focus on incidents and accidents and security of just how things go wrong all the time. And what we don't look for are, when we say how things go right, we're talking about just what are people doing every day that helps us overcome incidents. The best way I've heard this phrase is when we're talking about finding sources of resilience, resilience is kind of the story of the incident that you didn't have. So if we look at post-incident documents or postmortems, whatever you call them, and we say, okay, what went well here? Well, that could just be literally everything. Like I can just think of something that worked and that went well. So understanding like what are the things you really want to highlight? What are the challenges you really had to overcome in order to get past that incident? That's where you start to look for improvements and the interactions people have with the systems. Because someone could be doing something that 9 times out of 10 it works, but this one time it didn't. So what's going on there? So it's so much harder to discover the things that go right because we take them for granted. Because people who are expert users of the system, their expertise hides all of the effort that goes into dealing with all those little problems. So it's a bit counterintuitive or kind of ironic in that way.
So how do you go about trying to figure this stuff out? Is it interviews? Is it watching people?
It is. So incidents are really kind of the Trojan horse to all of this. So you take an incident and yes, you have the interviews, or we try not to use the term interview. It kind of sounds a little intimidating, but like you can have a chat with someone and you can start with, okay, tell me what went on here. And you start to poke and prod and you find threads that sound novel or interesting and you probe on those a little bit more. And you take that one person's perspective and then you kind of do it over again with other people who were involved in the incident. And you try to build up a narrative story of how we really got here. And the thing we try to go for is let's tell a narrative story and then let's break that story up into a few different sections, which would be, first of all, what kind of existed that made the incident not worse than it was? That is our way of looking at what went well. The other thing is what are kind of the risks that we can generalize out of it? Maybe there's a problem we found that we could solve for all of Netflix and not just this one team. And another is really highlighting the conditions that were there at the time that allowed the incident to occur. So what we're trying to do with this is get away from causal explanations of incidents Because when we're looking at incidents, just reconstructing like what caused it isn't sufficient. We end up missing a whole lot of stuff that what didn't really cause anything, but what was there, it existed. It was a problem to overcome. And if we don't find those things, they could be present in the next incident. Because if we're just looking at what caused it, we fix that thing, we move on to the next incident. All these other things could still be there. That once you fix an incident, like kind of by definition, your next incident's going to be totally different. No matter what you've done with one incident, it's not going to help you learn from the next one. Just that's the way it works fundamentally. So how do you go above and beyond that to dig into the things that may persist across multiple incidents? Where are the patterns? That's really what we're looking for in diving deeper and investigating them.
Very interesting, because I've heard you and a few others say there is no root cause. And you often say that it's kind of a perfect storm of things that have come together to deliver what actually happened. So I'm assuming that root cause analysis isn't enough these days just to figure out in a complex system what's happening.
Yeah. So it's a bit of an oversimplification. That term sounds a little demeaning. I promise it's not. My point is, if we're just looking at a kind of a causal chain, regardless of the kind of language policing of the term root cause that might happen, the thing we're getting at here is, ironically, root cause is a bit of a shallow term. When people are onboarding into software, we kind of teach them this as like, here's how you really get to the bottom of it. And so what we have to become comfortable with is there really is no bottom of it. You can go on forever. And it really depends on your perspective of, if I work on a certain team, I may care about an aspect of that incident that is many layers abstracted from something another team cares about. So when you're looking at causes, it's always through the lens of a perspective. And the whole idea of this like narrative story we tell is to bring all these different perspectives together so that we can find out where are the differences in people's mental models. Everyone kind of thinks they know how the system works, but everyone thinks that in a slightly different way. So these differences in opinions, in the ways that people think things works, are actually data we can use to help improve and readjust everyone's mental models as we continue to encounter more and more incidents. And they never stop, which is another thing to become comfortable with. I think in terms of management metrics, this becomes a really difficult conversation, because that's kind of like goal zero is not aspirationally, it's great, but fundamentally, it doesn't really prevent incidents. And you have to start thinking in a way, take the mindset that incidents are not preventable, they are inevitable.
Very interesting. So how would I, as an engineer, go about convincing my manager to care about these things?
Yeah, so that is the first question everyone wants to know is like, okay, so if I don't have any metrics, like what am I really looking at? Or because we talk about this as really being something that you have to make space for and invest in, how do we sort of get buy-in? And this is really easy if you are in a VP, CTO kind of position, because at a lot of organizations, you sort of get to call the shots. What's unique and novel about Netflix is the freedom and responsibility culture. So there are no mandates. I don't have to do something that someone tells me to. So, not in spite of that, but maybe in light of that, how do you get buy-in, right? You have to build a coalition among people. You have to find champions. You have to find people who are interested in this. So if we're talking about what sort of metrics could I look at to kind of make a case for doing more of this, what you'll start to see are like more people will start to attend post-incident review meetings. Like people will go out of their way to join these meetings because they're interested and they feel like they're learning something. The documents you write up will start to get more detailed and richer. New hires will start to use them for onboarding material. These are some of the things you can look for that are not necessarily metrics, but are definitely indicators that there is a need for this. And I think in a lot of ways, it's really pivotal to businesses' continued success that you learn from incidents. So the more buy-in you can get, it doesn't have to come from the top. But what you find is in cultures who are, let's say, different from Netflix in terms of maybe a little more command and control style, you have to find a way to either do this work kind of below the radar until you can make your case that it's more useful, or you start to convince your leadership that there is a different way, that we need to make space to be able to question the general assumptions that the organization has. That's a much more difficult problem. So I think a lot of people tend to opt for like flying beneath the radar sort of thing. That is absolutely a way to do it.
I think one of the key jumps I've seen people make is realizing that failure is not a bad thing. Kind of relates to this. 'Cause I see a bunch of managers who are, you know, just because of the nature of the company, the incentives, like failure is seen as hard failure, problems. But I think what I hear from you and other folks similar position to yourself, like failure at Netflix is happening all the time. You just complex systems, interaction with people, you're having to deal with this and make it so that it's not a big thing.
Yeah. So going back to this kind of pivotal paper that Dr. Richard Cook wrote called How Complex Systems Fail, outlines a few key points. And one of them is just failure is the normal state. Like failure is going on all the time. Everything is failing in some nuanced way. Nothing's ever 100% up. And as you encounter those are opportunities. We call these unplanned investments. It's really our responsibility to get as much out of those as we can, because they're going to keep happening and you will be able to make them better. But the things that you do to make them better are going to come with new failure modes. So the world around you is just constantly changing, and we have to keep up this capability to adapt to it.
Very interesting. And something you just said there reminds me, I was lucky enough when we met first in QCon New York to have chatted to John Allspore recently. And he talks a lot about building sort of adaptive capacity into systems. And I'm guessing you and him, you're quite aligned on this. And there's a whole community of you, I think, that are building up sort of ideas around building resilience or creating resilient systems, but building capacity for adaptation and reaction to failures and so forth.
Yeah. So John Allspore has sort of popularized this in software, and a kind of community has grown up out of this. The Lund University Human Factors program in Sweden is sort of an academic path to get there. But something I really like about the resilience engineering community is it's a bit at odds with academia in some ways. So a lot of people's reaction to hearing about resilience engineering as this like multidisciplinary field that has existed for 10 plus years is like, well, those are all academics. It's not practical, right? Those people who are calling themselves experts, well, the experts don't work here. But what I find is that particularly in software, which is great, is a lot of practitioners are going into the resilience engineering community. So it is not academia driven. Even folks like David Woods at the Ohio State University Cognitive Systems Engineering program, who are deeply involved in academia, are still incredibly practical and have done a lot of work through like 3 Mile Island, the Columbia disaster with NASA, really on the ground, out in the wild sort of stuff. The things the resilience engineering community is doing, it's not lab conditions. It's like watching people do their normal work. So a lot of the people who are doing this work, a lot of the books that are out there are just incredibly practical. Even if it's about aviation or medicine, you could replace those things with software and it would feel totally like they're talking about software.
Can you recommend any of those books offhand?
Sure. So I think the best intro is The Field Guide to Understanding Human Error. That is a really great intro for anyone. We've given it to some new hires here, and like their brain is just like, it's like the hello world to this sort of work, I would say.
Interesting. Very nice.
Another really good one is when John Allspore worked at Etsy, they put together the debriefing facilitation guide. So when we're talking about doing interviews with people or facilitating like postmortem meetings, there's a lot of good advice in the Etsy debriefing facilitation guide to help ask better questions, to kind of challenge assumptions. Because one of the things we find, and this is something that John Allspore has talked about a lot, is that experts aren't great at describing their expertise. So the better people are, and this is really true at Netflix or any company who kind of claims to hire the best, is that the better you get, the more you actually need people doing this sort of elicitation work to probe and ask deeper, harder questions, because it becomes more challenging for experts to do that. And so at a company that has mostly senior engineers, how do you share knowledge between people? You can't just hire senior engineers and be like, okay, we're just going to hire good people and we're going to stay good. But you actually have to make an active effort to invest in building a learning organization.
Wow, that's quite a deep one. How do you model some of that stuff? I mean, can you do that?
Yes, so there are different audiences for everything. You can't just have one meeting or a big giant incident review with a ton of people. You have to have little working groups. You have to have education classes. Following incidents, you have to sit down with people and say, show me how you normally do that, and really understand the way that teams do their jobs. So the responsibility here is in amplifying this effort by getting people engaged in reading it and sharing it, So as you start to see these documents linked out in Slack or cross-referenced in other documents, like, you're doing a good job.
That's very cool. So in addition to the knowledge sharing, which I can totally get as a really nice way to understand if people are getting involved in this, do you aspire to automate either the capturing, I guess, or even the responses, these kind of things? Is it automatable?
Some of it is, yeah. So I think people, when they're going to automate something, are in some cases looking for like a time savings. And I think you're not going to find much of that in automating this work. Like, there's always going to be a lot of curation. It's always going to be high touch. But what it does help with is helping find those patterns, helping visualize timelines, helping articulate things and organize them, make data consistent, that sort of stuff. So you could look at that as another one of those kind of metrics that as people are getting more interested in doing this work, they're going to start creating tools to help them do it.
Very interesting. Very interesting. Switching gears a little bit, something you quoted at QCon New York, and a big fan of Charity Majors. I'm sure we all are in this space. She said some amazing stuff. But she said that availability is made up and the nines don't matter unless the users are happy, which I thought was fantastic. How does that kind of thinking impact the work you do at Netflix?
Yeah, so we're not going to chase numbers. What I love about Netflix is there's almost an aversion to these kind of metrics. So once you get to a certain scale that you're talking about on a product level has a certain amount of nines, just the margin of error that goes into making that number accurate is almost bigger than the nines you're trying to report on. Like getting that fourth nine in your numbers is like, is it actually true or not? But Netflix is interesting because we have so many different devices in the field, people's smartphones, TVs, game consoles, that sort of stuff. And those all have a dependency on their internet service providers. So like when you're talking about the nines, which side are you looking at it from? Server side, client side? How do you aggregate all these metrics into one number? So the thing we go after is like, as availability really is kind of like a proxy metric, that means it has many different dimensions and people care about those different dimensions in different ways. So the first thing I would say is like, just bypass this conversation entirely and look at anyone who's doing support in your organization. That would be customer service, sort of like frontier kind of stuff. Have a feedback loop into your product managers. If you're not doing that, you're missing out on huge potential because people who are doing support in your organization know where all of the problems are. They know not just the things that impact availability. They know of all the nuances of just the things that are annoying that people complain about, that they're going off to solve to unblock users that maybe like no one knows that they're actually doing. So it is incredibly important. I hate to use the term like make the product people like feel the pain, but that is sort of the idea we're kind of putting across. It's like they need to be tuned into and have a pulse on the things that support people are doing in your organization. And that's going to impact your availability so much more than just kind of chasing the number and setting a goal, because kind of telling people to be better doesn't actually make them better. You have to kind of invest in building a system that looks at what are the user experience issues that are at play here? What are the kind of interactions people are having with the system that may not actually have anything to do with availability, but that they care really deeply about from a customer perspective?
So in relation to perhaps, encouraging people to get closer to the support and get closer to where the work's actually happening, I see a lot of folks talking around doing game days these days, kind of running actual scenarios of failure and how they handle it. Is that something you do at Netflix as well?
Yeah, so our team does one just specifically for our team to help diagnose issues that we could imagine. And this is both sort of an onboarding exercise, but it's also great for people who have been here a while too, just to like know what the tools are or like try to imagine scenarios that we haven't planned for yet and just role play what the response looks like. So a lot of teams do that across Netflix. As we're sort of expanding the scope of my team to touch different business domains, we're encouraging those teams to do game days. We'll partner with them and sort of facilitate it for them. This sort of goes hand in hand with setting up chaos engineering experiments as well. So you can start with a game day and then determine, hey, that actually makes a really good chaos experiment. And you can go back, and the nice thing is you can prove that you have been able to cope with all of this. So it's both like uncovering new surprising things in your system that you didn't know about, but it's also working towards what are like the coordination costs during an incident. I think that's a really peculiar thing that comes up in game days is like, I thought you knew about this thing, but it turns out you don't. And I actually don't know about it, what you think I'm an expert in either. We kind of refer to that as common ground. So the kind of like cost of coordination of an incident, of how do you organize your Slack channels? Who is the one person who knows about that one particular thing? These are all really cool things that come up in game days.
So as a final couple of questions, Ryan, can you share an interesting game day sort of result, or even an interesting failure result that you think the listeners might learn from or take inspiration from?
Yeah, okay. So interesting failure result, I think, is a pretty clever one. Is this one place I worked, we had services who all subscribed to kind of a command and control protocol. So we could manipulate our entire fleet of services by matching against a name of an application and giving it commands to sort of like manipulate its functionality at runtime, basically. So this already sounds a little dangerous. So it was sort of used primarily in emergency situations to like mutate the state of an application. But what turns out is someone implemented the command crash. And so this effectively restarted processes. So because this listened to command and control over kind of RPC to a sidecar process, this worked. But the system of how we matched against those application names was based on regular expression. And so someone typed in crash to an empty query, which you think would match nothing. The surprise here was that, well, nothing in this regular expression engine matched everything. And so every service at the company that implemented the basic set of commands, which now included crash, crashed immediately, globally, for the entire company. And that was quite a day. So what we discovered here is kind of the strange loops, the dependencies of what a cold start situation looks like at this company. Really kind of Armageddon scenario of like everything's gone away and we just have to bootstrap ourselves to restart. So this was a good few hours of just the entire company being down while we scrambled to get everything back online and figured out in what order to start up certain services, because some things were dependent on others. So when you're really talking about learning from success and not only failure, it really is that scramble to get everything working again, going back and digging through the pieces of what happened there, how the people involved knew the particulars of their service to get it up and sort of communicated with other teams. What did the coordination look like? How was the incident response? That's where so much of the learning came from, and we had a safe place to do it. It was okay that this person who pressed the button on the crash command did so, and we actually got a ton of information out of it. We were able to improve our service just hand over hand in terms of like the investment there. Well, yeah, it was a massive outage. We learned a ton, and in the long run, for the end game, really improved our service for customers despite this outage. So I think something that I find a lot of companies promising customers is that they'll never have another outage again, when I think the message really needs to focus on how much have you learned and are working to improve your service going forward to get as much out of these issues that you can, rather than kind of like paying the lip service to your customers that, oh, we're kind of working on it and it's not going to happen ever again.
Excellent story. Very interesting. If people are motivated by what they've heard today and they want to get started in the kind of thing you're doing, would you recommend any other references? I know you've already mentioned a couple of great books, but is there anywhere else you could point folks to learn more and follow in your footsteps?
Yeah, so some of my colleagues, Lauren Hochstein and also Nor Jones, have contributed to this GitHub repository that has a ton of information about human factors and resilience engineering at resiliencepapers.club. That is sort of an alias to get you there. I hope our team is going to be putting out a few blog posts in the near future, so we'll have some sort of like great getting started stuff. You can always contact me on Twitter. My DMs are open. It's @thishitshome, and those are separated by underscores. So I'm happy to chat with anyone more about this. I'm super excited about this topic.
Awesome. Really appreciate your time today, Ryan. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
What is happening in the programming language world? Which language has gained wider adoption? Check the Programming Languages Trends Report to make informed mid- and long-term decisions, or to choose wisely where you invest your time.